Does legalising same-sex marriage really reduce youth suicide? Just a few days ago, a small group of academics from Harvard and Johns Hopkins published this paper, which suggests an association between the introduction of same-sex marriage and a reduction in the rate of youth suicide attempt. It didn't take long for the media to jump on this story, as you'd expect. In a matter of days, the news was splashed all over newspapers from across the globe, saying that same-sex marriage reduces the rate of suicide attempts. But is this true, or is it fake news? Let's have a look at what the paper actually suggests. So the paper was, the lead author was Julia Raifman, and the title was The Difference in Differences Analysis of the Association Between State Same-Sex Marriage Policies and Adolescent Suicide Attempts. And what the paper suggested was, when same-sex marriage was introduced, youth suicide attempts dropped by 7%, and suicide attempts in LGB youth dropped by 14%. This data comes from the Youth Risk Behaviour Surveillance System dataset, which is available online from the Centres for Disease Control website. So let's have a look at this data. Okay, so we've got a chart here. On the x-axis we've got states, on the y-axis we've got the rate of attempted suicide. The dataset consists of surveys that are taken every 2 years in American high schools. The bars on this chart, the pink bars represent the suicide attempt rate at the survey immediately prior to the introduction of same-sex marriage in that state, and the yellow bar is the rate of suicide attempt recorded in the survey immediately after the introduction of same-sex marriage in that state. As you'll notice, looking across the different states there's quite a number that actually show that the rate of suicide attempt went up after the introduction of same-sex marriage, or stayed the same. In fact, the majority. Okay. So there's certainly no consistent pattern there suggesting that same-sex marriage is associated with a reduction in suicide attempt rates. The final two columns there are the overall suicide attempt rates, which are, in this case, an average of those states displayed in this graph. Obviously there's some states missing. That's because there was no data available for the survey either immediately before or after the introduction of same-sex marriage for those states. So I think it's pretty clear to see we've got no definite pattern there, to say the least, of a reduction. But the devil is in the detail. So let's have a look at the methodology that the authors used. They used a complex regression model to arrive at their estimates for suicide attempt rates. Among all youth, they estimated that suicide attempt rates fell by 0.6 percentage points, with a confidence interval between -1.2 to -0.01 percentage points. So we're sailing extremely close to the wind there, to say the least. In relative terms, this was where they got the figure of a 7% reduction So we need to ask the question, is this real statistical significance or a case of academic sophistry? So let's have a look at the data for the rates of attempted suicide among LGB youth in particular. Again, the pink bars are before same-sex marriage and yellow are after. Again, we've got a few states where the rate of attempted suicide actually increased after the introduction of same-sex marriage. So again, we've got no consistent pattern that we can draw from this data, and the data is very limited in this case. Again, the devil is in the detail. According to their regression model estimates, the suicide attempt rates among LGB youth fell by 4 percentage points, from 28.5% to 24.5%, and that was a 14% relative reduction. The authors admitted that there was very limited data available, and they also cautioned that there was potential for same-sex marriage to affect sexual minority identity. And indeed, when you look at the data, you see that in the years just following the introduction of same-sex marriage, there's a great increase in the number of youth who all of a sudden identify themselves as gay, lesbian or bisexual, and this obviously introduces bias into the results. This chart shows the rates of attempted suicide among LGB youth. On the x-axis we've got the years that the surveys were taken, and the red flags indicate the approximate time that same-sex marriage was introduced in that state. There's only 3 states that had anywhere near enough data to provide a trend before and after the introduction of same-sex marriage. For Massachusetts, the pink line, the trend is generally down both before and after the introduction of same-sex marriage. For Vermont, the orange line, there's a slight reduction after same-sex marriage followed by an increase, and Rhode Island, after same-sex marriage, we've got an increase followed by a decrease. So there's no consistent pattern whatsoever suggesting a downwards trend after same-sex marriage. Now this chart shows the rates of attempted suicide among all youth. On the x-axis we've got the survey number relative to the introduction of same-sex marriage, which is at the red line. So for instance, number 1 on the x-axis is the first survey after the introduction of same-sex marriage. Again here, there's no consistent pattern across the states. A number of the states show an increase in the rate of attempted suicide, while others show a decrease after the introduction of same-sex marriage. Now, what is the cause of the elevated attempted suicide rates amongst LGB youth? The authors of this paper suggest the narrative that's the popular narrative amongst the mainstream media, that it's due to stigma and discrimination. But is this actually true? The authors of the current paper are no doubt aware of the work of this man, Professor Paul R. McHugh, who's probably the leading psychiatrist in America, who produced a truly enormous, epic study last year with his colleagues. It was called Sexuality and Gender, and it was a review of all the literature that has been written in this area. McHugh found that there is only weak evidence that the elevated rates of psychological problems amongst LGB youth are due to stigma. In other words, discrimination and stigma alone does not explain the rates of attempted suicide and psychological stress experienced by this group. Studies have shown that same-sex attraction in itself is not a risk factor for suicide attempt, and neither is sexual identity. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, and that is sexual behaviour among young people. This is known to be a risk factor for suicide attempt among young people, and it's incredible that this issue wasn't covered in the current study. So let's have a look at the sexual activity data from the same data set that seems to have been ignored in this study. So this chart shows the percentage of youth reporting 4 or more sex partners in their lifetime. The pink bars are the heterosexual youth and yellow are LGB. So nationally there's a very significant difference between the two groups, and I've shown just a few states there where there are drastic differences with the rates of 4 or more sex partners among LGB youth being double or more that of heterosexual youth. Perhaps even more shocking is this graph. So this is for the United States, the nation as a whole. We've got here the proportion of youth who have engaged in sex before the age of 13. On the left we've got heterosexual identifying youth and LGB youth on the right. So we can see there we've got about double the rate of youth who have had sex before the age of 13. It doesn't take much to imagine that this would be associated with self-harm behaviours. Okay, points here are that early sexual activity is a risk factor for attempted suicide, self-harm and depression. LGB teens are more likely to engage in early sexual activity. So surely it's not a great leap from those two facts to suggest this could be a reason for the increased self-harm among LGBT youth. Okay, so there's a number of references there that I'd encourage you to look at yourself. Same-sex marriage activists all over the world have used this issue of suicide to promote their cause. With the help of the mainstream media and academics and of course opportunistic politicians. This is all done in order to make their opposition look like they are hateful people and homophobic. It's about demonising those who oppose them. But of course, this is not just a political game. There are real young people involved who are same-sex attracted. It is extremely dangerous for same-sex marriage activists and the media to send the message to these young people that somehow, just because same-sex marriage has not been legalised, it is natural or an expectation to harm oneself. If you're a young same-sex attracted person, don't believe anyone who tells you that anyone who's opposed to same-sex marriage is homophobic and hates you. It's not true.